Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise once again to speak about the urgent need to list the IRGC as a terrorist organization, to shut down their operations in Canada, to protect our friends and allies around the world, but also to protect ourselves. Mr. Speaker, I am sharing my time with my friend and colleague from Thornhill and very much looking forward to her remarks on this important motion, as well to concur in a report from the Justice Committee that calls for, among other things, the designation of the IRGC as a terrorist entity under the Criminal Code. Now, Mr. Speaker, Canadians have been anxiously following the news from the Middle East this weekend. The regime in Tehran launched a massive attack on the State of Israel. And this attack follows the October 7th attacks in which the Tehran-backed Hamas terrorist group brutally tortured, raped, and killed many Israelis. We again condemn these attacks, and we call for the release of all hostages. Many have correctly identified then and since the role that the regime in Iran has played supporting and backing Hamas. These faraway cowards seek to use the pain of the Palestinian people to advance their violent ends. Like Hamas's own leaders safely away in Qatar, the regime in Iran wants to attack Israel through proxies and with the maximal use of civilian human shields, while minimizing the risk to themselves. In this context, therefore, it is legitimate for Israel to take the fight against terrorism directly to Hamas's IRGC guides and paymasters wherever they live. Now, as I've said many times, conservatives seek a two-state solution in which Israelis and Palestinians can each pursue security and economic development through democratic, responsive, and pluralistic self-governing institutions. And let's be very clear that Hamas and IRGC terrorists do not want a two-state solution. They want to perpetually use the Palestinian situation as their justification for pursuing their selfish ends. The negotiated final status agreement that we hope for would in reality be the worst nightmare of these extremists, because these extremists thrive only in the midst of conflict and violence. Now, in the course of this weekend's events, it is worth recognizing and celebrating the effectiveness of Israel's defenses. Israel's defensive technology is what has allowed the world's only Jewish state to survive as a state, facing constant existential threats from hostile forces. If you believe in Israel's right to defend itself, then you obviously also have to believe in Israel's ability to procure the weapons that are necessary to defend itself. If you oppose the sale of weapons to Israel, then it's hard to make the case that you also believe in Israel's right to defend itself. Now, while recognizing the effectiveness of those Israeli defenses, I think it's very important to recognize the vital contributions and collaboration of some of Israel's Arab neighbors. Neighbors who have disagreements with Israel on various subjects, but who are collaborating in the pursuit of peace and of shared security interests. There is a fundamental alignment between Israel and many of its neighbors who are moving towards greater cooperation in response to the aggressive and colonial agenda of the regime in Iran. And I hope that this will provide the basis for continuing and growing collaboration and enhanced dialogue on a range of issues. Because we know how many Muslim-majority states in the region have been victimized as a result of the horrific violence coming from the regime in Tehran. We could speak about Lebanon, about Syria, about Afghanistan, about Yemen, about the civil wars that are unfolding because of proxies that are sponsored by the regime in Tehran. We could speak about the support that the Taliban have received from the terrorist regime in Tehran, the destabilizing effect of Hezbollah in Lebanon, and many, many other examples. The general capricious disregard that the regime in Tehran has shown for the peoples of all nations in the region. The constant genocidal demonization of Israel, but also violence against all peoples in the region and around the world. Now, needless to say, Madam Speaker, the fact that this attack was largely thwarted does not mean that it should be shrugged off or dismissed as merely symbolic. Indeed, the regime in Iran intended to break through Israel's defenses and intended to wreak havoc. It will try again. It will try in other ways, as it did on October 7th. And the regime in Tehran will continue to try to acquire more sophisticated and dangerous technology, including nuclear weapons, with which to attack Israel, with which to attack other peoples in the region, and with which to threaten the security of all freedom-loving peoples wherever they live. And the events of this weekend underline why Conservatives have been persistently calling on this government to recognize that the IRGC is a terrorist organization and therefore must not be allowed to operate in Canada. The call to list the IRGC as a terrorist organization means quite simply that we would use all of our resources to shut down any possibility of this regime operating in Canada. If they are a listed terrorist organization, they are not able to recruit, not able to fundraise, not able to promote their ideology here in Canada. And this, Madam Speaker, especially after the events of this weekend, is the least that we can do. But it didn't take the events of this weekend for Conservatives and for many other Canadians to realize that the IRGC must be listed as a terrorist organization. I put forward a motion in this House to list the IRGC as a terrorist organization 6 years ago. And this was before many of the events we have seen since, which I'll speak about. 6 years ago, the case was already clear. And at the time, in fact, Liberals, including this Prime Minister, voted in favor of that motion. They voted in favor of it. They said they were thinking about it. They still, 6 years later, still say they're thinking about it, and yet they have refused to act. Now, since that vote in this House of Commons 6 years ago, Madam Speaker, we have had the shooting down of Flight PS 752, an event of great personal significance for many of my colleagues from the Edmonton area, as we have had the opportunity year after year to go to memorials, to meet with families, and to hear the stories of pain and grief from these many Canadian families that have lost loved ones, Canadian citizens, murdered, when the IRGC shot down a civilian aircraft leaving Tehran, PS Flight 752. And yet that still wasn't enough for this government to recognize that the IRGC is a terrorist organization. Madam Speaker, since we've lived through the murder of Mahsa Amini, the women life freedom protest movement, as the Iranian people have, again, as they have in years and decades past, taken to the streets, calling for change, seeking the same things that we so often take for granted here in Canada, seeking the protection of their fundamental freedoms. The Iranian people are such heroes, are such an inspiration, I know, to so many members. And in spite of the sacrifice of those protesters, in spite of the murder, the torture we've seen targeting the people of Iran, the people that this regime supposedly governs, in spite of that, this government has refused to list the IRGC as a terrorist organization. It is utterly shameful, Madam Speaker. How much more violence do we have to see? How much more has to be done by this terrorist regime before our government finally recognizes and lists them as a terrorist organization? The civil wars in Yemen and Syria, terrorists operating systematically outside of the law in Lebanon and Iraq, the brutal suppression of the Iranian people, attacks on Israel, the murder of Canadians, and foreign-backed extremism here in Canada, intimidation of members of the heroic, patriotic Iranian diaspora community here in Canada. And yet this NDP Liberal government persists in failing to list the IRGC as a terrorist organization. We've actually put forward a private member's bill, Bill C-350, a bill that would list the IRGC as a terrorist organization and would take further steps to hold the regime accountable. And yet, Liberals have blocked efforts to expedite that bill. And so, Madam Speaker, we are putting this question before the House again, with our efforts to concur in this motion, which calls for the designation of the IRGC as a terrorist organization, and for additional steps to protect Canadians from foreign state-backed interference and to protect victims of violent extremism. This motion passed unanimously at the Justice Committee, and I hope it will pass this House when it comes to a vote. Thank you.
Questions and comments.